Hey, how you doing? We're going to split the hazardous waste part of this chapter into two videos probably because I have a lot of things to cover in there. There's a couple of videos within my video and I'll show those in class. But I want to make sure we have a good thorough understanding of hazardous waste because it gets talked about a lot on the AP exam especially. And so this video will just handle hazardous waste, what it is, and how we deal with it. I have another video that's got the laws and the very end part of chapter 16. So here it goes. Okay, this chapter begins with a story about the Love Canal. Now, Love Canal is probably the poster child for hazardous waste because it was not disposed of properly. The story goes something like this. Back in the early 70s, there was an abandoned hazardous waste dump. Nobody knew it was that, and it was called Love Canal. It was originally dug to be a canal to help transport barges back in the 1800s. And this trench was dug, but they never finished the canal. Later on, a chemical company called Hooker Chemical bought the land and dumped all sorts of nasty stuff back before there were rules against it, and then covered it up and sold the land. In fact, I think they sold the land to the school district and a local developer for $1. They were happy to get rid of it, as you might imagine. So houses were built on it, and then they noticed people in the neighborhood were coming down with sicknesses and diseases, so there was a hot spot that needed to be investigated. And that's where they found some of these chemicals had leached into the groundwater, and these people were drinking tainted water for years and years and years. And of course, that's what caused a major uproar. This is Lois Gibbs, and Lois Gibbs is a famous environmental name. You've got to know it. Lois Gibbs is a mom. It's a mom whose child got real sick. I don't think the child died, maybe. But here's the point. She got loud about her neighborhood and why everything was such a mess in Love Canal. She single-handedly got Congress to enact a law. It's called the Superfund Act, and I will cover that in the next video. So Lois Gibbs, just a mom, became an activist, and now to this day she goes around the country helping neighborhoods that think that they have hazardous waste pollution problems get recognized and get the kind of action that she succeeded in getting so many years ago. So what is hazardous waste? Well, there is a definition. It's one or more of 39 identified compounds. We won't list all 39. Some of them we've already covered. You can see this picture here kind of showing you. You definitely have hazardous chemicals at your house. There's no doubt that some of these things are very, very nasty. How they get disposed of matters, and it's important. But here's what I want you to memorize when it comes to the definition of hazardous waste. It's anything that's explosive, corrosive, or flammable. Write it down, memorize it. Corrosive, explosive, or flammable. There are a lot of things that you might think are particularly nasty chemicals that are not considered hazardous waste. And the reason the definition is important is because it must be disposed of specially. Hazardous waste cannot just be dumped at a landfill. It's got to be specially monitored. People with special training have to deal with this stuff. They know how to deal with it because they've been trained in that area, and they know how to dispose of it properly. So here are some of the things that are not hazardous waste, and it should surprise you. Radioactive waste is not explosive, corrosive, or flammable. Now, we have our own laws about how to deal with radioactive waste, but it's not found in the definition of what a hazardous waste is. Household wastes, like the things that you might flush down your toilet, mining wastes, oil and gas, drilling waste, liquids that contain organic hydrocarbons. Kiln dust can be explosive, but there's a limit to how much to meet the criteria. So regular old cement kiln dust is not considered hazardous. But you might remember that a sugar plant exploded up near Savannah a couple of years ago, and that was kiln dust, but it was actually in the processing of sugar. So these are things that are not considered hazardous. Kiln dust is if there's greater than 100 kilograms or something like that. You don't need to memorize that, but I just seem to remember something about that definition. So anything less than that is not hazardous waste. So I just thought I'd put this up here because it might surprise you to think some of these nasty things that come up in our lives that are not considered hazardous because they're not one of those three things: explosive, corrosive, or flammable. All right, how do we deal with our hazardous waste? 5 things. You need to know each one of them. 5 things that we do with our hazardous waste, and here they're listed here. What can we do to deal with our waste? Well, we can produce less of it. Remember, that's always the first choice. Produce less. And we can do it in 2 ways. If you're the guy in charge of a factory and you have to use some hazardous materials to make your product, find a way to eliminate that process. Stop using hazardous chemicals in your production, whatever it is you're making. Or you can find a way to recycle or reuse it. Sometimes these hazardous chemicals that you're done with can be the starting point, the input for some other manufacturing process. And we can help by, the government will put these 2 companies together and let them know you're creating some hazardous waste in your process, but some other company might be able to buy that from you because they need it to start some other process. But here are the things that we do with it. We can make it unhazardous, detoxify it, make it less toxic. Obviously, when it comes to something like an acid, that's not a hard thing to do. You all know how to deal with an acid. You neutralize it by adding a base. That's easy. But acids are corrosive, so an acid would be a hazardous waste. So a chemical method like turning an acid into a base by neutralization is a good method. We also have this thing called bioremediation, and again, you should be able to recognize these terms now by their prefix. Bio means life, and remediate is to go back. So bioremediation is using living things to go back and make it something that's not toxic anymore. And there are some applications in this area. One of them is through the use of microorganisms. Some microorganisms will break down a hazardous materials into something that's not hazardous anymore. Take the toxic out of the hazardous waste. Another thing we can do is use phytoremediation. What does phyto in front of anything mean? Plant. So this is the use of plants. This is especially a good technique if the hazardous material is in soil somewhere. Plant these plants. They will take the chemical up through their roots, and now the hazardous material is captured in the plant. Now we can just dispose of the plant. Much easier to dispose of a plant that has the waste in it than trying to dig up all of the soil where that hazardous material is found. And then the last thing we can do is burn it. Plasma torch is probably the hottest man-made device we have. It creates heats of up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. And there are some hazardous wastes that will break down and be destroyed when we can set them at such high temperatures. So we can use a plasma torch. So that's the way that we deal with hazardous waste, by taking the toxic out of it, making it unhazardous. Make it safe. Bioremediation, chemical methods, and plasma torch. Alright, the second way is by something we call deep well injection. This is dangerous. We worry about doing things like this because once that stuff is put down into the ground, we don't know what's happening to it. And you can see from this diagram here, if the walls are made of steel, if it's encased in steel and probably clay as well, if it's well encased, it's not a bad technique because after all, it's not taking up any land. There's no habitat destruction here. There's no land being taken up to deal with the hazardous waste. But what if it leaks? What if, because you can't see it, it ends up breaking into the groundwater, for instance? These are major concerns with deep well injection because you can't really see it to make sure that everything is fine. And because it's out of sight, out of mind, it encourages waste production. If you don't see, big buildings filled with 55-barrel drums of hazardous waste, you start to get a feeling of complacency. You kind of get the feeling that, well, we don't have to worry about this. It's not a big problem. If it's done properly, it's not a bad technique. But of course, you have to have the land. It needs to be the right type of land. For instance, you don't want to do it in an earthquake zone because what if that earthquake cracks the casement here and lets the stuff get out? That would not be good. All right, so we can detoxify the hazardous waste or we can inject it into deep wells. The third way that we can deal with it is through a hazardous waste landfill. You remember the diagram I showed you about how we operate a regular landfill? Well, this would be much like that, except you can see way more attention to detail, way more protection in terms of the different layers that protect it. You're going to have dirt, you're going to have clay, you're going to have plastic liners, maybe even steel encasement here to protect so that this stuff doesn't leak out. You want to make sure it doesn't get down here to the groundwater. And of course, you're going to have one of those monitoring wells, a groundwater monitoring well, so that you can check the water every day and make sure that nothing is seeping down into the groundwater. Here's a plastic liner. This is using a plastic double liner. It's got a double leachate collection system. So any of these nasty chemicals, if they eat through the cask that they're being held in, the drum that they're being held in, and it drips down, the leachate collection system can take it up. And of course that leachate collecting system can be pumped. There it is here. It can be pumped so that we know that there's a problem. We'll also be able to detect if there's any escape of the hazardous material. You can see gas vents, a clay cap on top, very, very specialized landfill. And again, this is not your best option probably. It takes up a lot of land. And once again, we're burying the hazardous waste. You don't know what's happening down inside. Remember, these things are flammable or corrosive or explosive. If they're corrosive, they'll eat through no matter what container you put them in. So it's a source of worry. But that's one of the things we do. This hazardous waste landfill would be very heavily guarded and monitored so that people couldn't get there. Be fenced off so that animals wouldn't try to eat the grass on the surface, etc. Number 4, above ground disposal. Now this probably is the safest because we can see these things. We know if this 55-gallon drum starts to leak because we're monitoring it every day. But it's more dangerous for people. Obviously, here's a guy that has to work here all day, every day. So they're monitoring this stuff, but there is some risk. It also takes up a lot of land. So there's habitat destruction here. You got to build roads, and you're going to have this out in the boondocks. it's going to be far away. So this stuff has to be transported. What if the truck gets in a crash? You know, it's got to be transported. It's got to get to the place, and then it's stored. But like I said, the one big plus to this method is you can keep an eye on these hazardous wastes and see if anything's leaking, if there's any storage problems. You can deal with them right away. And the last one, we can send it to other countries. Now this is something that was done for years and years and years, because developing countries don't have very strict guidelines about how to handle hazardous waste, and they're hurting for cash. A company that creates the hazardous waste might call a country in Africa and say, hey, we've got a shipment of hazardous waste, will you take it off our hands? We'll pay you. And of course they're happy to take the money, and because they don't have any strict rules or regulations about how to deal with the hazardous waste, they'll just dump it any old place. That's a problem, especially for the people that live in these countries. And I told you the story about that one place in India with the e-waste. Polluted a whole village. This is against the law now. The UN convened, and it's called the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste. And the UN said this practice of developed countries sending it to developing countries has got to stop. So the Basel Convention stopped it from happening. It's a potential huge profit for these countries, but we're trying to put an end to it. Many developing countries are now refusing the waste because of the Basel Convention. But remember, all of these UN conventions, they have no teeth. There's really no law broken if a country does take this hazardous waste. Still, we're trying to get developing countries to understand it's not a good policy for them to make money by taking hazardous waste from other countries. Well, that's the 5 things that we do to deal with our waste, and that was way quicker than I thought it would be. So I'm going to end this now anyway and start a new video on how we regulate hazardous waste in the United States. There's 2 laws that you must memorize. See you in a minute.